The first sound that echoed through the old walls of Bletsoe Castle on that cold February night was not the gentle cry of a newborn, but the sharp, agonizing scream of a girl barely stepping into her teenage years. Margaret Beaufort was only 13, and yet history had placed upon her shoulders the unbearable weight of motherhood, widowhood, and dynasty, a kingdom in turmoil. The year was 1457, and England itself was a land divided. The Wars of the Roses had already begun to unsettle the kingdom. The bloody contest between the House of Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose, and the House of York, represented by the White. Behind this conflict were claims of legitimacy, royal bloodlines, and the ruthless ambition of nobles who cared little for the people suffering in the streets. But for Margaret, none of this mattered in the moment. The fate of kings and nobles was distant compared to the very real, immediate struggle she faced. The battle for her own life and for the child who stirred within her womb. Inside her chamber, the stone walls seemed to press closer with every passing hour. Shadows flickered in the dim torchlight as midwives whispered their concerns. Some prayed silently. Others avoided looking at one another, as though afraid to voice the fear that filled the room. "This child is too young," one murmured under her breath, wringing her hands. "She cannot endure this. God have mercy." On the bed, Margaret's slight frame arched with pain. Sweat plastered her hair to her pale face. Her thin arms gripped the sheets until her knuckles turned white. Each wave of agony seemed to tear her apart, and yet she clung to life with a stubborn determination that would come to define her entire existence. The blood of kings. Margaret was no ordinary girl. She was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. Through him, her blood carried the proud, if dangerous, legacy of the House of Lancaster. From the moment of her birth, she had been marked as valuable, a pawn to be married, a prize to be claimed, a potential mother of kings. When she was barely 12 years old, she had been wed to Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund was ambitious, calculating, and determined to secure his family's hold upon the throne. For him, Margaret was not a child but a tool, her womb a vessel for the dynasty he dreamed of building. But fate is cruel. Edmund would not live to see his heir. Struck down by plague while Margaret was still heavy with his child, he left her a widow before she had truly become a wife. She was barely more than a child herself, yet the world had already taken from her the freedom of choice, the innocence of youth, and the security of protection. Now she lay alone, trembling and gasping in her chamber, forced to bring into the world a child who would carry not only her husband's legacy, but the future of an entire dynasty. The chamber of pain. The birthing room was a world unto itself, a place where life and death waged war over the body of a young girl. The air was stifling with the scent of tallow candles, damp straw, and the iron tang of blood. Outside, the winter winds rattled the shutters, but inside, Margaret's screams drowned out the world. The midwives bent over her, whispering prayers and orders. "Push, my lady, push. The child must come now." But Margaret's voice, hoarse with agony, cried back, I cannot bear it." Her body was too slight, her hips too narrow. Every contraction tore through her with a violence that seemed to threaten her very existence. The women attending her exchanged worried glances, knowing that many a girl had died in such circumstances. Too young, too fragile, sacrificed upon the altar of dynastic ambition. Margaret clung to her rosary beads, her lips murmuring prayers even as she screamed. Her faith, strong even in childhood, was the only anchor she had in that storm of pain. Between ragged breaths, she whispered, "Lord, let me live, let this child live," the widow's burden. For Margaret, this was not only a physical trial, but a spiritual one. She was already a widow, and yet barely a woman. Edmund Tudor's death had left her exposed in a world where men used and discarded women as political currency. Without her child, she was nothing, vulnerable to remarriage, to manipulation, to being cast aside. With her child, however, she would hold a weapon far greater than swords or armies, a claim. If she could give birth to a son, she would not only be a mother, she would be the mother of a potential king. And so, in that cold February night, Margaret Beaufort fought with a strength that no one believed she possessed. Her cries grew hoarse, her body exhausted beyond measure. Hours passed like eternities. The midwives urged, pleaded, prayed, as sweat and blood stained the sheets. The girl who should have been learning her letters, who should have been playing in gardens, was instead locked in mortal combat with death itself. At last, as dawn's pale light crept through the shutters, a new cry pierced the chamber. This time, it was not Margaret's scream, but the first wail of the child she had fought so desperately to deliver. A son, Henry Tudor. Margaret collapsed against the pillows, too weak to lift her head, but her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. She had survived. The child had survived. And though neither she nor the midwives could have known it, this frail infant would one day wear the crown of England, the beginning of a dynasty. The girl who had been deemed too fragile, too young, too weak to endure, had given birth to the founder of a dynasty. Her body bore the scars of the ordeal. Her youth had been consumed in a single night of torment, but her determination had prevailed. Margaret Beaufort, child bride, widow, and mother, had stepped onto the stage of history. She would not leave it again until she had seen her son crowned king. The night had given way to dawn, and with it came a silence that felt heavier than the cries that had filled Bletsoe Castle hours before. Margaret Beaufort, just 13 years old, lay motionless on the bed of carved oak, her body limp with exhaustion. Her lips were pale, her skin slick with cold sweat, yet in her arms lay the tiny bundle that the midwives had wrapped in linen. Her son, Henry Tudor. The child was weak, his breath shallow, but he lived. Against all expectation, both mother and child had survived. In the dim light of morning, Margaret studied his face with wide, fearful eyes. His skin was soft as silk, his fingers impossibly small. And yet she knew this child was not an ordinary infant. He was Lancaster's last hope. For Margaret, the price of his birth had been steep. Her narrow hips and small frame had nearly broken under the strain. The midwives whispered that her body was too fragile, that she might never bear another child. She was a girl who had been forced into the role of womanhood too soon, and the ordeal had marked her forever. Still, when Margaret looked down at Henry's tiny face, her heart burned with something fierce. She was no longer only a child, nor merely a widow. She was the mother of a potential king. The shadow of widowhood. Margaret's marriage to Edmund Tudor had lasted scarcely a year. Now he was gone, carried away by plague while she was still heavy with child. His death left her vulnerable, her wealth and lands exposed to the greed of others. In the turbulent politics of England, widows were pawns to be remarried, traded, or stripped of power. The men who governed the realm did not see Margaret as a grieving girl. They saw her as an heiress, and her infant son as a bargaining chip. The Council of the Regency, ruling for the half-mad King Henry VI, quickly acted to secure her future. They placed her under the wardship of Edmund's brother, Jasper Tudor, the loyal Earl of Pembroke. Jasper had been at her side during the long night of labor, and it was he who now stood guard over both mother and child. Jasper knew the child's importance. He looked upon Henry not simply as his nephew, but as Lancaster's last fragile hope in a kingdom spiraling toward war. Whispers of danger. Outside the castle walls, England was unraveling. The Wars of the Roses raged between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. Lancaster's fortunes were sinking fast. King Henry VI was feeble and prone to madness. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, fought fiercely to defend their son's claim, but the Yorkist armies pressed harder with every passing year. In such a world, a newborn boy with even a drop of royal blood was both blessing and curse. Margaret knew it. She could feel the weight of destiny pressing upon her child. Henry's claim to the throne was slim, but real. Through Margaret's bloodline, the Beauforts, descendants of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, the child carried a spark of legitimacy. For the Yorkists, that spark was dangerous. If Lancaster fell, this boy could be hunted down, extinguished before he ever reached manhood. Margaret understood the peril. She had been raised among whispers of ambition, of bloodlines and claims. Now, at 13, with her body broken from childbirth, she clutched her son to her breast and swore an oath only she could hear. I will see him safe. I will see him crowned. A girl transformed. The days after Henry's birth blurred into a haze of pain and recovery. Margaret could scarcely walk. She felt older than her years, her childhood stripped away by widowhood and motherhood alike. But though her body was frail, her mind sharpened. She had seen death's shadow and survived. She had endured where others thought she would perish. In that survival, she discovered a resilience she had never known before. Jasper Tudor recognized it too. He visited her often in those early days, speaking gently, urging her to rest. But Margaret would not rest. She asked questions about Lancaster, about York, about the king's failing health, and always about what must be done to protect her son. Jasper saw that this was no ordinary girl. Beneath her quiet voice burned a will of iron. And so, in the cold spring of 1457, while warlords schemed and armies gathered, a fragile boy lay swaddled in cloth, watched over by a girl who had nearly died bringing him into the world. No one knew it yet, but the story of Henry Tudor and the destiny of England itself had begun. The winds that swept across Wales carried with them the scent of smoke and iron. Battles were no longer distant rumors. They were a storm breaking upon England. Margaret Beaufort, now 15, watched the world collapse into chaos while her fragile son, Henry, clung to life in her arms. Henry was barely 3 years old when the Yorkist sun rose over the horizon. Edward of York, handsome, tall, and ruthless, seized the crown from the feeble Henry VI. The red rose of Lancaster, to which Margaret had given her loyalty and her blood, was suddenly withered and torn. For a mother so young, the threat was clear. Her child was no ordinary boy. He was Lancaster's last thread, the fragile heir who, if discovered, might be hunted down and destroyed. Margaret felt that weight with every breath she took. The second marriage. In 1458, under pressure from her guardians and the King's Council, Margaret was married again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford. He was older, steady, and more cautious than Edmund Tudor had ever been. Where Edmund had burned with ambition, Stafford was pragmatic, a man who had seen enough of England's cruelty to know survival mattered more than dreams. To Margaret, the marriage felt less like a union and more like another cage. She wore her wedding gown, rich velvet, heavy with jewels, yet she felt herself chained to duty once more. Still, Stafford was kind. He did not treat her harshly, nor demand the impossible. In time, Margaret grew to respect him, if not love him. But in her heart, there was only one devotion that mattered, her son, Jasper Tudor's vigil. Though Margaret was remarried, Jasper Tudor never abandoned his watch over young Henry. He understood better than anyone that the boy's life carried weight far beyond the walls of Pembroke Castle. Jasper trained soldiers, fortified defenses, and whispered strategy to Lancaster loyalists. But when he returned to the nursery, he was simply Uncle Jasper, lifting the child into his arms, showing him the world from the height of a strong man's shoulders. Margaret trusted Jasper more than she trusted her new husband. She confided in him, leaned on his strength. She even admitted the vow she had spoken the night of Henry's birth, that he would one day wear the crown. Jasper, though cautious, did not laugh at her. He only nodded and said, "Then we must keep him alive long enough to claim it." The Field of Towton. March 1461 brought with it the bloodiest day England had ever seen, the Battle of Towton. In freezing snow and sleet, tens of thousands of men clashed. The red rose and the white rose tore each other apart, and by nightfall the fields were littered with corpses. Lancaster was crushed. Edward of York was now King Edward IV, his power secured by rivers of blood. For Margaret, the news was like a knife in her breast. She prayed in her chapel, her lips trembling as she begged God for mercy. She pressed her rosary so hard into her palm that the beads cut into her skin. And then she turned her gaze to Henry, sleeping in his cradle, and whispered through her tears, "If all the world falls, still you shall rise." Growing danger. Edward Ivy's reign brought danger close at home. Lancaster's nobles were hunted, their estates seized, their children scattered. Jasper Tudor became a marked man, pursued from stronghold to stronghold. Henry, barely a boy, was forced into hiding. Margaret endured the torment of separation. To protect Henry, he could not always remain at her side. There were nights she lay awake in her husband's manor, her hands pressed over her empty womb, longing to hear her son's breathing. She knew only that Jasper guarded him. Each separation deepened her resolve. She would suffer anything, remarriage, loneliness, fear, if it meant her son's survival. The mother's mask. At court, Margaret wore the mask of obedience. She curtsied to Yorkist lords, smiled where she must, and bowed her head to King Edward IV. But behind her downcast eyes burned a quiet hatred. Every word she spoke was chosen with care, for one slip could mean ruin. Whispers followed her, of her wealth, her lineage, her strange intensity for one so young. Some said she was too pious, too rigid. Others claimed she was ambitious beyond her years. They were all correct. Margaret's faith and ambition were bound together in one truth. God had spared her in childbirth, and in that mercy he had marked her son for greatness. The oath strengthened. By the time Henry was 5, Margaret's oath had hardened into destiny. She fasted often, knelt in chapels until her knees bled, and spoke of divine providence. She was certain God himself had chosen Henry to redeem England. When she clasped Henry's small hand in hers, she felt the weight of kingship pressing upon his tiny fingers. She whispered prayers into his ear, prayers of protection, prayers of triumph. And though the boy did not yet understand, his mother's fire began to kindle something within him, a quiet, watchful strength. The spring of 1464 brought with it a deceptive calm. The clash at Towton had already stolen the breath of England, and the House of Lancaster lay crushed beneath York's banner. Yet within the palaces of London, whispers stirred like smoke curling from a dying fire. Margaret Beaufort, barely out of girlhood, a widow still cloaked in black silk, moved silently among the glittering courtiers of Edward IV. She was a relic of a defeated cause. Her son, Henry Tudor, was a child hidden away in Wales, protected only by her prayers and the thin wall of Jasper Tudor's loyalty. To Yorkist eyes, she was harmless, a young mother, pretty but pious, too delicate to pose any threat. And Margaret, clever as ever, leaned into that illusion. She learned the art of lowering her lashes at the right moment, of hiding the sharp edge of her thoughts behind serene half-smile. When Edward's courtiers circled her, testing, she responded not with politics but with charm. Her gowns were cut daringly low, as fashion demanded, emerald silk and crimson velvet, clinging to her body in ways that turned heads. Let them think her a harmless beauty. Let them underestimate her. At night, however, the mask slipped in her private chamber. Before a crucifix lit by flickering candlelight, Margaret pressed her forehead to the cold stone floor. She prayed with a passion that bordered on fury. God, grant me strength. My son is a true heir. If I must bow today, let only be to rise tomorrow. Her hands, small and pale, clutched the rosary so tightly the beads bruised her skin. Henry was her fire. Each time she thought him, his frail chest rising with shallow breaths, his dark eyes gazing at her with innocent trust, she felt something ignite. The world might strip her of power, of freedom, of dignity, but it would not touch him. Jasper Tudor was gone now, driven into exile. York's victory left her son exposed, but Margaret proved herself more dangerous than the men who underestimated her. She arranged careful marriages, whispered into ears at court, and cultivated a massive loyalty to Edward IV, all while weaving invisible threads that bound her to allies across the realm. One evening, as court feasted, Margaret stood in the great hall of Westminster. Golden torchlight shimmered over long tables groaning with roasted meats and spiced wine. Musicians played, and laughter echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. At the far end, Edward IV lounged like a lion among his pride, broad-shouldered, handsome, and with eyes that missed nothing. His queen, Elizabeth Woodville, sat beside him, her beauty like frost, cold, dazzling, untouchable. Margaret curtsied low, her emerald gown sweeping the floor. The neckline plunged scandalously, revealing pale skin that caught the firelight. She knew the courtiers watched. She knew Edward himself noticed, though she kept her eyes humbly lowered. For a heartbeat, she felt the king's gaze linger. It was a dangerous game, but Margaret played it with purpose. Later that night, she slipped from the hall, her steps echoing through silent corridors. She carried no jewels now, only a folded parchment pressed to her breast. Within her chamber, she broke the wax seal and read by candlelight. The letter came from Jasper across the sea, Words of survival, of waiting, of a boy growing into something more than fragile hope. Henry lived. That was enough. She kissed the parchment, pressing it against her bare skin, between the rise of her breast where her rosary usually lay. In that gesture was both devotion and defiance. The Yorkist court saw only a widow playing her role. None saw the storm she nurtured in silence. The winds that swept across the coast of Brittany carried salt and sorrow. Henry Tudor, still little more than a boy, stood at the edge of foreign shore and gazed toward the horizon where England lay hidden beyond endless waves. He had been torn from the green hills of Wales, ripped from the familiar arms of his mother, and cast into exile under the protection of the Duke of Brittany. The Breton court was no home. Its language was strange, its stone halls cold, and its people curious about the frail boy who carried the blood of Lancaster. Henry felt like a relic, an heir without a throne, a prince without a crown. His dark eyes watched everything, cautious, calculating, though his frame was thin and his body weakened by years of sickness. At night, when the Breton nobles feasted, Henry sat silently, observing. He learned the way men bargained with their eyes before their lips moved, how alliances were stitched not in war, but in whispers. Already he was more student than child. He understood that survival in exile required more than loyalty. It required silence, patience, and the ability to endure humiliation. Back in England, Edward IV ruled like a lion at the height of his strength. His court glittered, his army stood unchallenged, and Margaret Beaufort bowed dutifully before him. Yet even across the sea, Henry felt her prayers like a chain pulling him toward destiny. She was his anchor, his shadow, his voice carried in memory. He remembered her words before he had been smuggled away. You are Lancaster's hope. You are God's instrument. Bend if you must, but never break. He had been too young to understand fully, but in the cold nights of exile, her voice returned to him, keeping him upright when despair whispered otherwise. One evening, as storm winds howled, Henry was summoned to the Duke's hall. The Breton ruler sat upon a high seat, his cloak lined with fur, eyes sharp with the cunning of a man who weighed lives like coin. You are Lancaster's boy, the Duke said, his French tongue thick. Your name is useful, though your crown is far. I keep you not from kindness, but from advantage. Remember that. Henry bowed low, hiding the flicker of pride in his chest. He knew he was a pawn, but pawns, if they survived long enough, could reach the far side of the board and become kings. That night, lightning slashed the Breton sky. Alone in his chamber, Henry lit a single candle and stared into the flame. He saw not only his own reflection in the molten wax, but the faint outline of a crown that did not yet rest upon his brow. He whispered a prayer, steady and determined. Far across the sea, in England, Margaret Beaufort knelt in her own chamber, her forehead pressed against the stone floor, whispering the same prayer. Though mother and son were parted by miles of ocean and walls of politics, their voices rose together like twin sparks in the darkness, destined one day to ignite into fire. The court of Edward IV glittered like sunlight on steel, dazzling, dangerous, and never still. Margaret Beaufort, wrapped in velvet and restraint, moved among courtiers with the caution of a chess player handling glass pieces. To the world, she was the obedient widow, the loyal subject of York. But within, her mind burned with the careful fire of rebellion. Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen, still carried herself like a woman who had fought destiny and won. Her golden hair shimmered in torchlight as she stood at her husband's side, but her eyes, sharp and restless, never stopped calculating. She had risen from widowhood into royalty, and though Edward's love had placed her on the throne, the nobles never forgave her for it. She was both queen and target. Margaret watched her from across the hall, sipping wine with lips that hid 1,000 unsaid words. She saw in Elizabeth not merely a queen, but a fellow mother, a woman who had fought the tide of men's power and carved space for her children. Margaret's own son, Henry Tudor, lay across the sea in exile, while Elizabeth's brood filled the royal nursery like bright jewels in a crown. The two women had rarely spoken beyond courtesy, but destiny wove their threads closer with every passing season. Both knew the instability of the York crown. Both knew that one misstep, one death, one betrayal could change the world. Edward IV, larger than life, filled the chamber with his laughter. His dark eyes gleamed with pleasure, and his broad chest was crowned by silks and jewels. Yet beneath the revelry lay sickness, the creeping hand of fate. He was not the invincible king he once had been. His breath grew shorter, his temper quicker, and though he tried to mask it, death was drawing near. Margaret sensed it like a hawk feels a tremor of prey in the grass. The coming storm was not yet seen, but its scent filled her lungs. That night, when torches burned low, Elizabeth Woodville lingered alone in the chapel. Her prayers spilled from lips pressed tight with desperation. She prayed for her husband, her children, for the safety of her dynasty. But when she rose, she found Margaret waiting at the door, half shadow, half fire. "Our sons," Margaret said softly. Her words, though few, carried the weight of oceans. Elizabeth's gaze narrowed, her queenly pride flickering like a candle. "Your son is far, Lady Margaret. Mine are here. Mine are in danger." Margaret stepped closer, her face pale but resolute. "Then we are bound, you and I. For if Edward falls, your sons will be prey to Richard of Gloucester's hunger. And if they fall, only mine remains." The silence between them was thick, filled with centuries of bloodshed between Lancaster and York. And yet, for the briefest of moments, the two women breathed as one, bound not by banners, but by motherhood and fear. Elizabeth's lips curved into a thin, bitter smile. "You play a dangerous game." Margaret's eyes shone like iron catching fire. "All survival is a game, Your Grace, and I intend for my son to win it." Beyond those stone walls, shadows thickened. Richard of Gloucester watched, waited, and sharpened his claws. The bells of London told like sunlight on the summer air of 1483. Dazzling, dangerous, and King never still. Edward IV was dead. Margaret Beaufort, leaving the throne to his velvet and restraint. Edward moved among courtiers with the caution of a chess player, handling rode into the city surrounded by loyal retainers. She was the obedient widow, his loyal subject of York. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, within, had pulled him close to her with the careful fire of rebellion. Fate tore him away. Elizabeth placing in the hands of his uncle, White Queen Richard, still carried herself like a woman who had fought destiny. Richard played the part of protector. Her golden hair shimmered in torchlight as she stood at her husband's loyalty. But her gestures, full of humility, sharp and restless, to the people, never stopped. He was a noble uncle. She had risen from guardian to young king. And though behind his pale eyes flickered a hunger darker than ambition, the nobles never forgave her for it. The hunger for she was both queen and target. Edward V and his little brother across the hall, Duke of York, sipping wine with lodged in the Tower of London, unsaid words. Officially for their safety, she saw in Elizabeth not merely a queen, yet every mother and fellow mother knew the truth. A woman who had fought the tide of man's power and carved space. Safety is the last thing to expect. Margaret's own son, Elizabeth Woodville, sat lay across the sea in exile. Her daughters huddled around her nursery. She had fled there with trembling haste. The two women had rarely spoken beyond courtesy. Her eyes were swollen their threads closer, with every passing white from silent prayers. Both knew the instability. She knew Richard's promises meant nothing. Both knew that her sons, her jewels, her legacy, betrayal, were trapped behind stone walls that echoed the betrayal. Larger than Margaret Beaufort filled the chamber with his laughter, felt her heart dark eyes like a blade with pleasure. For years she prayed for the downfall by silks and jewels, for the chance to raise her son Henry from exile into kingship. The creeping hand of fate. Now he was not the invincible king he once had been. Yet Margaret was no fool. His breath grew shorter. She knew Richard's rise temper was no gift from God. And though he tried to mask it, upon England, death was drawing. The rumors came first like Margaret sensed it like a hawk. The princes had not been seen for days. The coming storm was not yet seen. Once lit by childish laughter, filled her lungs. Dark. That night, their guard when torches burned, servants dismissed. Elizabeth Woodville lingered alone in the chapel. Then her prayers spilled from lips pressed tight. Had they been silenced? She prayed for her husband, her children, but every tongue the safety of her dynasty. Elizabeth wept in the shadows of the abbey. She found Margaret daughters clinging to her shadows. They are only children. Our sons, she whispered, Margaret said softly, over and over. Her words, her grief was raw, carried the weight like of oceans. An open wound. Elizabeth's it was then that narrowed. Margaret came to her, her veiled pride flickering like a candle. The two women, your son is far, enemies by Lady blood, Margaret, but allies by mine fate. Are here. Sat across from each danger in the dim chamber. Margaret stepped closer. They are gone. Her face pale but Elizabeth choked. Then we are bound. Her voice broken glass. For if Edward falls, boys, your sons will be prey to Richard of Gloucester's hunger. Richard has taken them from me. Only mine remains. Margaret laid a hand upon hers. The silence between them was firm and cold as stone, filled with centuries. Then we must make a king strong enough to stand against him. And yet, your sons are briefest of moments, only mine remains. 2 women breathed as one. The words were cruel, bound not by banners, but they were true, but by motherhood and Elizabeth fear. Flinched. Elizabeth's lips curved into a thin, yet in that bitter fire smile, she saw clarity. You play a dangerous game. Her daughters, her blood. Margaret's eyes shone like iron catching fire. And if they could be bound to Henry Tudor, all survival is a game. Her eldest, your Grace, Elizabeth of York, and I intend for my son to win it. Then Woodville and Lancaster together could rise against Gloucester. Richard of Gloucester watched, waited, Elizabeth's grief sharpened into purpose. A marriage, she whispered, her gaze steady now. Your Henry to my Elizabeth. Let their union be the weapon to strike Richard down. Margaret's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. It was the look of a woman who had carried ambition like a rosary for decades, now tasting the answer to her prayers. And so, in the dark belly of England's sorrow, a pact was sealed between 2 mothers, one who had lost her sons, and one who had kept hers hidden like a precious blade. The wind outside howled against the abbey walls, as though the spirits of the lost princes themselves bore witness. The winds that swept across the French coast carried the taste of salt and exile. In Brittany, Henry Tudor walked the halls of a borrowed fortress, his shoulders draped in a cloak too heavy for his frame. He was no longer the frail boy Margaret Beaufort had once cradled in trembling arms. He was a man hardened by years of wandering, sharpened by the knowledge that he bore the last living hope of Lancaster. His exile had been long, his days filled with the loneliness of a prince without a crown. Yet word reached him, carried across the channel like whispers on the tide. Richard of Gloucester had stolen the throne. The princes were gone. England trembled, and the eyes of desperate men turned toward Henry. Margaret's letters came to him in secret, ink-stained by her urgency. God has opened the path, my son. England needs you. The people will rally, for York's usurper sits cursed upon a stolen throne. Henry would sit by the flickering fire in the Breton night, his mother's words clenched in his hand, and wonder if he was truly strong enough. He had been raised in fear, kept alive only by fortune, hidden from assassins, from kings, from fate itself. And now fate demanded he return not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. By his side stood loyal men, Jasper Tudor, his steadfast uncle, John Morton, the shrewd bishop who wove alliances with his words, and a handful of exiled knights who dreamed of glory. They were few, yet they were enough to light the fire of rebellion. In London, Richard III sat upon the throne like a shadow carved from iron. His crown gleamed, but his people's eyes held no love for him. The disappearance of the princes haunted every street, every marketplace. Mothers held their sons tighter. Priests muttered sermons of justice denied. And though none dared accuse him aloud, every whisper carried his guilt. Margaret Beaufort knew the moment was ripe. She moved through the English court, like a flame hidden beneath silk. She spoke softly, listened intently, and planted seeds of treason in the hearts of those who despised Richard's rule. Lord Thomas Stanley, her husband, pretended loyalty to the king, but listened carefully to his wife's counsel. The Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, turned bitter against him, his pride wounded and his faith shattered. It was Margaret who tied the threads together. Elizabeth Woodville's daughters, the memory of the murdered princes, the discontented nobles, and her son Henry waiting across the sea. In a small chamber lit by one sputtering candle, Elizabeth and Margaret met again, their veils drawn low. "Richard has stolen everything," Elizabeth whispered, her voice edged with fury. "He has stolen my sons, my crown, my very breath. But he cannot steal the future. If Henry comes, if he weds my Elizabeth, then both Lancaster and York will be his. The people will rise." Margaret bowed her head, her eyes shining with iron will. "Then so it shall be. I will see Henry crowned, even if my blood must be the price." And so the pact deepened. Across England, messengers rode by moonlight, carrying secret oaths of loyalty to the Tudor cause. In Brittany, Henry sharpened his resolve, preparing ships and swords for the storm that would soon break upon England's shores. But fate is never kind without trial. Richard's spies whispered treason. The Duke of Buckingham rose in rebellion, banners of defiance flying against the king. Yet the rivers swelled with autumn floods, drowning roads and scattering men. Buckingham's army faltered, his courage withered, and Richard crushed the rising with merciless fury. Buckingham's head fell to the axe, and London cheered, though their cheers rang hollow. Margaret's heart clenched with fear. Her son's chance was slipping, and her own life now dangled by a thread. Richard accused her of treason, and only Stanley's careful maneuvering spared her from ruin. Yet Margaret did not break. Even with her estate seized, even with her life under watch, her letters still reached Henry, urging him forward. In France, Henry watched the storms lash the coast and knew his time would come again. The crown of England was a ghost, but one day soon it would rest upon his brow.